Hi guys, welcome to another painting walkthrough. Again, thank you very much for your support, really appreciated. Here you can see I'm starting out with the retro wave sunset color palette. Had an idea for a painting of like a close-up of a shop. I was actually walking down to my local chip shop, and I just love the street. There's just this row of shops, but the chip shop itself just glows. There's a chip shop and a Chinese shop, Chinese takeaway shop, and they both just glow, and they have these large windows, and I really loved them, and it just gave me an inspiration for this image here. So I started out by just creating a kind of the form of the shop in the foreground, and a character just leaning against a window, and then just laying down lots of other colours, getting that depth, going into the distance with a sort of a cyberpunk cityscape. So you can see here, just adding the glow and the light from the shop window, which the shop window actually starts out just as this block, but as time goes on, I think the thing that sets it apart is when I start adding reflections in there. Not using a reference for this character. If you remember my last painting, I talked about not using a reference for the characters. But on this occasion, it didn't work. I was actually very pleased with not using a reference on the last ones, but I got things a little bit out of proportion for this one here. But I do fix it a little bit later. I think if you haven't noticed it already, you'll probably realise that the body's just way too stretched above the waist. So it's kind of like you've got the top half of one person and the bottom half of another person. So they just don't match. So that's something I come back. And again, it's one of those things that you need a bit of time to come back and have a look to realise that you got it out of proportion, and it's just sort of training your brain to see it sooner. Started adding what I thought might be the internal sort of what's going on in the shop, like someone behind a counter or something, but it didn't work, so I just painted over it. The idea in this one was there was two soldiers in the background approaching. That's why the painting is actually called Soldiers Approach. So it's kind of these two military police or something like that approaching in the distance, and we've got our character in the foreground here who's playing it cool or ready for something, or something's about to go down. And it really is all about having a narrative to the painting, having a story, which I guess it gives people a reason to look at the painting, because when I think they can relate to it and start to see something going on, it becomes more visually interesting. Not always the case, but I think it's just something I enjoy doing. Just fleshing out these characters. I don't actually really I didn't want any detail really in those characters in the background. I just wanted to give the impression. So I'm just sort of playing with highlights and shadows just to sort of give an idea of where they are and a bit of a reflection. They're a little bit too big, so I shrunk them down a little bit there as well. I did add the skirt because I was thinking about using, my character Anya in there. And I thought she'd be wearing exactly the same clothes, but actually it didn't work with the skirt. It worked much better with these sort of jeans. I think it's still definitely her character, and I've used it as a reference, but I just think the clothing just needed to change for this particular image. Just didn't work with the skirt. One thing I needed to do here was actually, you saw the window was this big pink block, and actually the foreground was a very, very pink. I had to separate the foreground from the background, and so what I did is that in the end is I drew a lasso around the whole foreground area, and then just changed the hue until it looked like a satisfying colour and there was enough separation. And I've settled on this sort of indigo purple sort of look. You can see I've got that nice, I don't know if it's a sunset or whether it's just really bright city lights in the background, which again just separates those soldiers from their background as well. And it is all about contrast. That's what I think a good painting is you see different things in there, and the reason your attention is drawn to them because of the contrast between them and whatever's behind them. Decided to draw in this motorbike here. This is completely, again, from memory, not the best bike, but you'll see I'll start to improve that later with some reference images and bring in some photos in. But one thing I realised with the painting as I came back and looked at it was the foreground was the very, very foreground the closest thing to the viewer, which was just this road, and it was very uninteresting. So I thought, well, I need something there to almost give you a route into the painting, or just set the distance between the foreground and where our character is leaning against that window. And I think it just provided a bit more narrative and a bit more of a visual interest, really, as well. So you can see I bring in an image here, and just use it to sort of add a little bit of detail to the handles, the light, and some of the body as well. The wheel, particularly the wheel and the suspension. And you can see I'm using lots of different parts of the bike because it's a very, very different perspective. I couldn't find any images of the similar perspective to here, so I was just taking little bits of the bike and using them to sort of give a bit more detail to things like the handlebars, the more intricate parts of the bike, basically. The perspective was very difficult to get right in this instance, because again, it's a very difficult perspective when you've got something that's such a complicated piece of machinery, really. So trying to get that perspective right was actually quite tough. I think I did a good job here, though. I think it definitely gives the impression of what's going on. Got that tiny little like boot part of the bike which just doesn't work, and I do improve that later. This is massive saddle on there, which I think is not accurate. And I also think it ruins the perspective. You can see how now I'm painting this larger sort of thing here, and it starts to work a little bit better. Good thing is I've got a good source of light to play with, light and dark. So this big bright window is casting its light onto the bike, so it kind of helps. Now I'm just adding detail in the back, and I started seeing the form of a car as I was painting. So I thought, you know what, let's just roll with that. Painted it in, and it really started to work. Had to increase the size of it a little just to bear in mind the proportion of the soldiers that are nearby, because depth was very important to this painting, and I think in some cases I got it right, some cases it didn't quite work. For instance, this bridge I'm drawing here, I think the angle's wrong, because you actually you're kind of seeing the top of the bridge and not underneath the bridge, and we should actually be seeing underneath the bridge more so. But we can actually see quite clearly what's on top, and so that perspective doesn't work, and it starts to make the soldiers look a lot bigger than the bridge. So that's one area that definitely could be improved in future. Getting these lights underneath the bridge going. At one point I was debating whether to leave the background very, very foggy and misty like that, but then for better or worse I started adding lights to the buildings in the background. Getting the cat in here, Mido. This was almost like a warm-up drawing of the cat, which didn't work. The position of it felt a little bit random as well. It's almost like kind of center of that road, and it didn't really work. I was playing with the position of it, and it looked a little bit uninteresting as to what the cat was doing there. It looked a little bit like a lost pup, not lost puppy, a lost kitten. And it just didn't work. Then I thought I'd have the idea of it looking a bit more distant in terms of its demeanour, so it's kind of just wandering the streets. So I did this second sketch here, and it proved really useful to do this warm-up sketch, even though I didn't think it was a warm-up sketch. It worked as a warm-up sketch, and the second time I drew the cat, it worked a lot better. So you can see that's the cat just wandering off into the distance. Had this idea for some kind of, I've got that bridge there on the left, but on the right I wanted a bit more of a futuristic style air bridge type walkway, I guess. So I created that curve towards the top of those buildings on the right there. Created another car in the distance heading towards us. I thought making it a police car would work, so I added a few sirens on top. And here you can see I'm starting to add the lights to the building in the background using the hard flat brush that I've got. Always remember that I tend to set that brush on a color dodge, just to add that glow around the light, so that there is sort of a feeling of it being dense, really. Adding a lot more light to the top, just over the top of the bridge, looking over, just to give the impression that those buildings actually go a little bit higher. These buildings on the right, which I'm painting now, I think I did the best job with those. I really actually liked the abstract kind of lines on them. They looked a lot much more futuristic. And even though they're all sort of different shades of red, really, there, it looks multicolored and it looks quite intricate and quite interesting. Whereas in the distance on the left, I think it's looking a little bit messy. Here I actually go against the usual thing. What I like to do is I've gone close up to the face to get a bit more detail in the face. I still get it wrong, so I definitely had to go in later and correct it again, which you will see. Getting those lights on the top. And this is what I mean by the perspective being wrong. On that bridge on the left, you shouldn't actually be able to see the car lights because we're actually much lower. The bridge we should be looking underneath the bridge, and so the perspective is totally wrong there. So that's one of the mistakes I make. Here now I try to start adding a bit more detail to the shop. So I start with figuring out what it's going to say. So I just went with open late. A lot of debating on that, but open late was what I went with. Then just painting over the top. To make it look a lot more painterly, adding a bit of a colour dodge to it to glow. And then I created a series of posters. I thought quickly mock up some posters. I was going to bring in some images that I'd done like I did in my last painting, but I just decided to mock some stuff up. I think they work quite nicely actually. They're quite simple. They look like adverts as opposed to anything else. They're supposed to be like about, one was maybe a product, one was like some body enhancement, and one was maybe, I think it was about like a charity or something like that. I'm not sure. Nations for Change. Very, very rough, because I know that by the time I shrink it, it's not going to matter. And obviously, while I put these very, very sort of contrasty colours on there and saturate colours, I then use blending modes to set them back behind the shop so they sort of match the piece. Messing around with the camera raw filter, as you know, normally add a bit of sharpening. Sometimes play with the white balance, bit of grain occasionally, but mainly I play with those color profiles. Adding a few curves here. And then adding the reflection in this window, which was a lot of the missing piece, really. So I added a bit of a reflection of our character here using white. Bearing in mind that really the only bits that are going to reflect are the bright bits, not the dark bits. Or the bits that we're going to see anyway. So that's why it was quite abstract. And then adding these sort of sweeping lines across the window, just bright sweeping lines to give that sort of impression of a reflection as well. Making sure that I wanted the ground to look a little bit wet, so I was trying to add these reflective lights to the ground of the car. I actually really liked both the cars that I've created actually, because they were very, very rough, but it's that thing where it creates an impression, and so you get what it is. Brought in a stock image here, reversed it, and then used it as a reflection in that shop window as well, which worked really well. Experimented with bringing in some city lights, but they didn't work, so I got rid of it. Brought in some texture for the ground, which just adds a little bit more than just those paint strokes. Try to use that image for reflection. I'm not entirely sure if it works or not. Probably going at it with a tool much bigger than needed. That part of the building was actually quite complicated, so just adding a bit of glow and a bit of interest. And it's that variety in the architecture as well, which I'm starting to try and include a lot more nowadays. Some of the stuff I've done. A bit more blue in the siren, and then adding a bit of buildings to the back as well. Because one thing, it's starting to look a little bit empty behind those people, behind those soldiers. So I had to have a very, very faded, distant city in the background, so it was still separating them and adding a bit of glow there just to make sure it did separate them. But I didn't want the city to look like it just disappeared in that gap, so I had to make sure there was a bit of depth there. Adding a vignette here just for a bit more interest. Very subtle vignette, but definitely putting one in there. And actually, one thing I did realise with this painting was that the colours that I'd done for the shop were a bit garish. And it wasn't until I changed it to CMYK, I tested the CMYK look for print, that I realised that the CMYK version of the purples were much better. So I toned them down and brought those in. Changed the face a little bit there to make it look a little bit more believable in terms of the lighting. Still very rough. And here you can see I just shrunk the character right the way down, so that's a lot more in proportion. And if you didn't notice it before, I think you definitely realise it now that character looks way more in proportion than it did before. Painting around the edges just to perfect it a little bit. And then just comparing. You often see me flick backwards and forwards just to compare, was that change worth it? And there we go. That's the final image. Let's close with the bike. There's our characters. And there you go. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll catch you on the next one.